Before Visa became a global financial network, there was a much simpler problem. People wanted to buy things. Banks wanted their customers to spend. And merchants wanted to be paid. But there was no easy way to connect all three. Cash worked. Checks worked. But neither was particularly convenient. Then something strange appeared. A small piece of plastic. The idea was simple. Instead of carrying cash, you could carry a card. But the card created a new problem. If a customer walked into a store, how would the merchant know the customer could actually pay? And if the customer belonged to another bank, who would move the money? Someone had to sit in the middle. Someone had to connect the customer, the bank, and the merchant. That sounds simple now. At the time, it was a completely new way of moving money. And one bank was about to experiment with it on a scale nobody had seen before. In 1958, Bank of America launched something called BankAmericard. It wasn't Visa yet, but the idea behind it would eventually become one of the biggest payment networks in the world. And the first experiment was about to get very messy. In 1958, Bank of America tried something that sounded almost absurd. It gave people a new way to spend money before they actually had the money in their hands. The bank sent thousands of BankAmericards to people across California. No application. No long approval process. The cards simply arrived, and people started using them at restaurants, at stores, for everyday purchases. But there was a problem, a very big one. People didn't just spend the money. Some of them spent too much. Bills started piling up. Merchants were confused. Banks struggled to process everything. And the system was nowhere near as controlled as it needed to be. What had started as a revolutionary experiment was quickly becoming a financial headache. Bank of America had created something people clearly wanted, but it hadn't yet figured out how to control it. And then came an even bigger problem. The bank was doing the hard work, but other banks were watching. Because if this strange little piece of plastic actually worked, there was no reason Bank of America should be the only bank allowed to play. And that was the moment the idea began to escape. BankAmericard was no longer just a Bank of America experiment. It was becoming something much bigger. Something the bank would eventually have to give away to survive. Bank of America had a problem. The card worked. People wanted it. But the system was becoming too big for one bank to control. Other banks had noticed what was happening, and they wanted in. At first, that sounded like a threat. Why should Bank of America help its competitors? But there was another problem. A card is only useful if people can use it almost everywhere. One bank could issue cards, but one bank couldn't build a payment network across an entire country. So Bank of America began licensing the system to other banks. They could issue their own cards, while using the same basic network. That changed everything. The card no longer belonged to one bank. It was becoming a shared system. And that created something much more powerful than a credit card. A network. The more banks joined, the more merchants accepted it. The more merchants accepted it, the more customers wanted it. And the more customers wanted it, the more banks had a reason to join. It was a loop. And once that loop started growing, Bank of America couldn't simply pull the plug. The idea was becoming bigger than the company that created it. And eventually, the name on the card would change. BankAmericard would disappear. Something else would take its place. A name you already know. Visa. BankAmericard was growing. But the bigger it became, the less sense it made for one bank to control it. Banks in different parts of the country wanted to participate, and they didn't want to operate under someone else's name forever. So the banks began organizing themselves. The idea was simple. Instead of one bank owning the entire system, the banks could share it. That decision changed the future of the card. In 1970, a new organization was created to manage the growing network. And a few years later, the name BankAmericard was dropped. The new name was Visa. It was short. It was easy to recognize. And most importantly, it wasn't tied to one bank. That mattered, because Visa wasn't trying to become America's biggest bank. It was becoming something different. The infrastructure between the bank, the customer, and the merchant. And that distinction would become incredibly valuable, because Visa didn't need to sell you a loan. It didn't need to manufacture anything. It simply needed to make sure the payment worked every time. And the more payments it processed, the more powerful the network became. But there was a problem hiding underneath all of this. Visa could connect the transaction, but someone still had to take the risk when customers spent money they didn't have. And that is where the business becomes much more interesting. By now, Visa had something incredibly valuable. Not money, not a bank. Something much simpler. Connections. Every time a customer used a Visa card, 4 different players were involved. The customer, the merchant, the customer's bank, and the merchant's bank. And somewhere in the middle, Visa. But Visa wasn't paying the merchant. And it wasn't giving the customer the money. It was moving information. The customer wanted to buy something. The merchant wanted to know if the payment was good. The banks needed to communicate. Visa connected them. And for doing that, money changed hands. Not necessarily a lot from one transaction. Sometimes just a tiny amount. But Visa wasn't interested in one transaction. It wanted millions. Then billions. Because that is the secret of a payment network. You don't need to make a fortune from one payment. If you can sit in the middle of billions of them, and suddenly, a card swipe that feels almost meaningless to you becomes part of an enormous machine. But there was another advantage. Visa didn't need to convince every customer to keep money in a Visa account. It didn't need branches on every street. It didn't need to decide whether you were worthy of a loan. The banks did that. Visa simply built the road and charged for using it. That model was about to become extraordinarily powerful, because once a payment network becomes large enough, leaving it becomes difficult, and joining it becomes almost necessary. Visa had discovered something that had very little to do with credit cards. It was about human behavior. People go where they know they can pay. Merchants accept the payment methods their customers already carry. And banks support the networks their customers already use. That creates a strange kind of trap. If very few merchants accept your card, customers have little reason to carry it. If very few customers carry your card, merchants have little reason to accept it. But Visa had already started breaking that problem. More banks meant more cardholders. More cardholders meant more merchants. More merchants meant more transactions. And more transactions made the network more valuable. Then the cycle repeated. This was no longer just a payment card. It was becoming infrastructure. And infrastructure has a powerful advantage. Once people depend on it, Replacing it becomes painful. A merchant doesn't want to lose customers. A bank doesn't want its customers complaining that their cards don't work somewhere. And customers don't want to carry 5 different cards, just in case one isn't accepted. So everyone had an incentive to stay connected. Visa didn't have to own every bank. It didn't have to own every store. It just had to become the connection that everyone expected to be there. And that changed the economics completely, because Visa could grow. Without opening a bank branch on every corner, it could expand. Without manufacturing a single product, the network itself was the product. And the bigger it became, the harder it became to challenge. But there was still one question. If Visa was simply connecting everyone, who was actually paying Visa? And how much could a company really make from something as small as a card transaction? Visa doesn't need you to pay it directly. You don't get a Visa bill. You don't send Visa your monthly payment. You probably don't even think about Visa when you tap your card. And that's exactly what makes the business so interesting. The money comes from the system around the transaction. When you buy something, your bank is involved. The merchant's bank is involved. And the payment network sits between them. Each transaction creates a tiny piece of economic activity. A tiny fee here, another fee there. And Visa participates in that flow. Now imagine that happening millions of times. Then billions. Suddenly, a fraction of a transaction isn't so small anymore. This is where Visa's business model becomes powerful. It doesn't need to convince you to spend more money than you normally would. It doesn't need to manufacture more phones. It doesn't need to build more stores. It simply needs more payments to travel across its network. And payments were about to explode. Credit cards were spreading. Debit cards were coming. Computers were becoming faster. Businesses were becoming more connected. And eventually, the internet would arrive. That changed the game completely. Because now, a payment didn't have to happen at a physical store. It could happen from a computer, then a phone, then almost anywhere. Visa had built the road before most people even realized they were going to need one. And suddenly, that road was everywhere. But there was one thing Visa couldn't control. The companies building the machines people used to access the network. And eventually, those companies would become powerful enough to challenge the entire payment industry. The card had started as a piece of plastic. Now, it was becoming something much bigger. Computers were entering banks. Electronic terminals were entering stores. And slowly, the payment began disappearing from view. You could still see the card, but behind the counter, machines were talking to other machines. A transaction that once required paper, a telephone, and a bank employee could now happen electronically. That changed the speed of everything, but it also changed the scale. A payment network that could process transactions electronically could handle far more payments than one built around paper. And Visa understood something important. The future wasn't going to be about carrying the right card. It was going to be about making the payment work wherever the customer happened to be. A store, a hotel, an airline, a telephone, a computer, and eventually, a website. The physical card was becoming almost irrelevant. The network behind it was what mattered. And then the internet arrived. Suddenly, the merchant didn't have to be across the street. It could be on the other side of the planet. The customer didn't have to hand over a card. They could type the numbers into a computer. and Visa's network could still sit in the middle. This was a huge opportunity, but it created a new problem. The internet had made buying easier. It had also made stealing easier. There was no cashier looking at the card. No signature. Sometimes, there wasn't even a physical card, just numbers on a screen. Visa had spent decades making payments easier. Now it had to figure out how to make invisible payments trustworthy. The biggest change in payments wasn't a new card. It was making the card disappear. Online shopping changed everything. A customer could buy something without walking into a store. A merchant could sell something without ever seeing the customer. And the payment could happen without either side touching cash. But Visa had a problem. How do you trust a transaction when you can't see the person making it? For decades, merchants had relied on something simple: a card, a signature, sometimes a face-to-face interaction. Now all of that could disappear. Someone could sit behind a computer, enter a card number, and look exactly like a legitimate customer. The payment network needed a new way to decide what was real. So the industry began collecting more information. Where was the transaction coming from? What device was being used? How unusual was the purchase? Was the amount different from what the customer normally spent? The payment itself was becoming a calculation. Millions of tiny decisions, made in fractions of a second. Approve, decline, approve, decline, and most customers never saw any of it. That was the real evolution of Visa. It wasn't simply processing payments anymore. It was helping decide which payments should happen. And that made the network even more valuable. Because when you become responsible for trust, you become difficult to replace. But there was another transformation happening at the same time. People were beginning to carry computers in their pockets. And soon, the card wouldn't even need to be in your wallet. For decades, the card was the thing people carried. The network was hidden behind it. Then the smartphone changed the relationship. Suddenly, the thing people carried everywhere wasn't their wallet, it was their phone. And that created a new possibility. What if the card didn't have to exist physically at all? You could store it inside a phone, tap the phone, and the payment could happen. To the customer, it looked almost effortless. But underneath that simple tap, an enormous system was still working. The merchant sent the payment request. The bank checked the transaction. The network moved the information. And the payment was approved. In seconds, the plastic had almost disappeared. But Visa hadn't. In fact, this was exactly what a payment network wanted. Because Visa didn't need you to see it. It needed you to use the system. And the smartphone created billions of new opportunities to do exactly that. You could buy something in a store, order food, book a flight, subscribe to a service, buy something from another country. The payment could happen almost anywhere. And the more places payments became possible, the more valuable the network became. But now Visa had a new problem. It wasn't alone anymore. Technology companies wanted into payments. Banks wanted more control. Merchants wanted lower costs. And consumers wanted everything to be faster and easier. The payment industry was becoming a battlefield. And Visa was sitting right in the middle of it. Visa was no longer the only company in payments. MasterCard was growing. American Express was already powerful. Banks wanted more control. Technology companies wanted a role, and merchants wanted to pay less. Everyone was looking at the same transaction, but everyone wanted something different from it. The banks wanted customers. The merchants wanted lower costs. The technology companies wanted the payment relationship, and the networks wanted more transactions flowing through them. That created a strange battle, because the customer rarely cared which company processed the payment. They cared whether the card worked. They cared whether the payment was accepted. They cared whether the transaction was secure. And that gave the payment networks a very unusual advantage. The best network wasn't necessarily the one with the flashiest product. It was the one that was already everywhere. A customer walks into a store. The merchant accepts Visa. The customer uses Visa. Another transaction enters the system. Then another. And another. The network keeps growing. But merchants had a problem. They were paying fees every time customers use cards. And when you run a business on thin margins, even small fees matter. So merchants began pushing back. They wanted lower costs. They wanted more bargaining power. And regulators began asking questions too. Was the payment industry becoming too concentrated? Could a handful of networks become so powerful that businesses had no real choice? Visa had built something incredibly difficult to replace. But that strength came with a price. The bigger the network became, the more people started asking, who should control it? The strange thing about Visa is that most people don't think about it as a business. You don't walk into a store looking for Visa. You don't choose a Visa bank branch. And you don't wake up thinking about using Visa today. Yet, every time money moves through its network, Visa can be involved. That is an unusual business. It doesn't need to sell you another pair of shoes. It doesn't need to convince you to upgrade your phone. It doesn't need to build another shopping mall. It benefits from the activity already happening around it. People are going to buy things anyway. Businesses are going to sell things anyway. Banks are going to move money anyway. Visa built itself into the middle of that activity. And scale makes the model even more powerful. Imagine earning a tiny amount from one transaction. It doesn't sound impressive. Now multiply that by millions. Then hundreds of millions. Then billions. The individual transaction disappears. The network becomes the business. And that creates another remarkable advantage. Visa can grow without growing in exactly the same way as a traditional bank. A bank needs branches, employees, buildings, capital, loan officers. Visa's core network doesn't require a new branch every time another customer joins. More payments can travel through the same underlying infrastructure. That's why the economics become so interesting. The company isn't simply selling a card. It's monetizing movement. The movement of money between people, businesses, and banks. And the more the world moves toward electronic payments, the more important that movement becomes. But there is a catch. Visa doesn't control the entire transaction. It depends on banks. It depends on merchants. It depends on technology. And it depends on people continuing to trust the system. So the real question isn't, how much money can Visa make? The bigger question is, how difficult would it be for the world to stop using Visa? Visa never needed to become the bank. It didn't need to lend you the money. It didn't need to own the store where you spent it. It didn't even need to know what you were buying. It needed one thing: to make the payment happen. again, and again, and again. That sounds simple. But simplicity is exactly what made the model powerful. Think about a road. You don't think about the road every time you drive somewhere. You think about where you're going. But someone still built the road. And every business along that road depends on it. Visa built something similar for money. A kind of invisible financial road. Banks connect to it. Merchants connect to it. Consumers use it. And money keeps moving across it. The genius wasn't creating a better credit card. The genius was creating a system that other companies could build their businesses around. And once that system became widespread, the network itself became extremely difficult to replace. That's the lesson hiding inside the Visa story. Sometimes, the biggest business isn't the company selling the product. It's the company sitting underneath the product, making everything else work. You might forget which card you use today. You might forget which store you bought something from. You might never even notice the network behind the transaction. But somewhere underneath that ordinary purchase, a massive financial system is moving. And that system was built, one transaction at a time. From a risky experiment in California to a global payment network, the plastic card was never really the story. The network was. And that is what Visa ultimately learned to monetize. Not the wallet, not the card, the movement of money itself.